In the soot-stained streets of 19th-century London, a man's worth was not measured by the gold in his pocket, but by the height of his hat. To the Victorian eye, the top hat was more than an accessory. It was a crown of civility, a rigid, upright chimney of felt that separated the gentleman from the filth of the gutter. It was a symbol of order, dignity, and absolute refinement. The taller the hat, the closer the man felt to the divine status of the elite class. But look closer at the strange, shimmering sheen of that felt. Reach out and touch the exquisite texture of the beaver fur and the fine silk lining. There is a secret hidden deep within those fibers, a flicker of light that does not come from the afternoon sun, but from a liquid silver demon. To make these hats so incredibly stiff, so smooth, and so aesthetically perfect, the entire industry relied on a ritual of slow-motion suicide that few dared to speak of in polite society. They called it carroting. It was a brutal chemical process where raw animal fur was bathed in a volatile, orange-tinted solution of mercuric nitrate. And as the toxic steam rose in the dimly lit, unventilated workshops, the very air transformed into a ghost, a silver specter that began to eat away at the men and women who breathed it in. This was the beginning of the end. Behind every polished silhouette of a London gentleman stood a hatter whose soul was being slowly dissolved by the very elegance he created. The price of fashion was being paid in sanity, breath by breath, as the silver demon claimed its first victims in the silence of the factory floor. Step into the workshop of a master hatter. It is a place of suffocating, damp heat and a cloying, sweet-smelling fog that sticks to the back of your throat. In this shadowy corner of the industrial world, the invisible fire of our previous chapters takes on a different, more fluid form. It is not radiation, nor is it a creeping fungus. It is a heavy metal mercury, a liquid that refuses to be contained by any human vessel. Mercury is the only metal on Earth that remains liquid at room temperature. To the ancient alchemists, it was a divine miracle, but to the Victorian hatters, it was simply known as the carrot. As they meticulously brushed the mercuric nitrate onto the raw pelts, the volatile chemical began to break down the organic fibers, making them soft and easy to mat together into fine felt. But mercury is a jealous and restless element. It does not stay on the fur. Under the intense heat of the heavy smoothing irons, it transforms into an odorless, colorless vapor, a lethal silver breath that enters the lungs with every gasp of the worker. Once inhaled, it crosses the blood-brain barrier with terrifying ease, beginning to slowly rewrite the very nervous system of the man standing at the bench. The walls of the workshop seem to sweat liquid silver as the invisible specter fills the room. These men were unaware that every breath was an invitation to a silent predator. They were trading their cognitive functions for a perfect finish. As the silver vapor settled into their bones and brain tissue, the tragedy of the Mad Hatter was no longer a fairy tale. It was a biological inevitability. The industry's silence was as heavy as the metal itself, ensuring that by the time the first symptoms appeared, the Hatter was already a ghost in his own body, haunted by the very brilliance he sold to the world above. The descent into madness is not a sudden, dramatic fall. It is a slow, rhythmic, and agonizing shaking. It all began with what the local workers grimly referred to as the Hatter's Shakes. At first, it was something easily dismissed, a subtle, involuntary twitch in the eyelids during a long shift, or a slight tremble in the fingers when reaching for a specialized tool. To the untrained eye, it looked like simple exhaustion or the chill of a London morning. But in reality, it was the first silent scream of a nervous system under siege by elemental mercury. The silver demon is incredibly patient. It accumulates within the soft tissue, atom by atom, until the minor twitches grow into violent, uncontrollable spasms. Soon, a man could no longer walk a straight line across the factory floor. His gait became heavy and erratic, like a marionette with tangled strings. He could no longer perform the simplest human task, like feeding himself without spilling his soup or buttoning his own coat. In the dark, judgmental storybook of the Victorian era, These broken men were often whispered about as clumsy or shameful drunkards by those who passed them on the street. But they weren't drunk on gin. They were intoxicated by the very elegance they were painstakingly creating for the ruling elite. Their tremors were not the result of vice, but the physical manifestation of their brains short-circuiting under a tide of silver. As their hands vibrated with a frequency they could no longer govern, they lost more than just their livelihood. They lost the basic sovereignty over their own bodies. Every ripple in their tea was a countdown to a deeper horror, as the Mercury prepared to move from the trembling muscles into the fragile sanctuary of the mind itself. Mercury doesn't just break the body, it fractures the very foundation of the soul. This is the origin of the term mad as a hatter, not a whimsical joke, but a clinical descent into a psychological abyss. The chemical began to systematically erode the personality of the sufferer. Hatters who were once jovial, articulate, and hard-working became victims of erethism, a profound, agonizing state of pathological shyness and irritability. Imagine a man who becomes so utterly terrified of being observed that he would abandon his post and cower in a dark alleyway if a stranger merely spoke to him. They suffered from violent fits of uncontrollable rage, followed by deep, hollow bouts of paralyzing depression. Their physical appearance mirrored their mental decay. They lost their teeth to the silver poison, their gums bled a metallic gray, and their speech became a slurred, unintelligible mumble, as if their tongues were weighted down by leaden weights. Their reality was becoming a fever dream they couldn't wake up from. In the judgmental eyes of Victorian society, they were becoming eccentric, much like the character Lewis Carroll would eventually immortalize in his surreal Wonderland. But the real Mad Hatters didn't spend their days hosting colorful tea parties with March hares. They sat alone in the dark, their bodies vibrating with a frequency they could no longer govern, their minds filled with a corrosive paranoia that turned every flickering shadow into a sharp-toothed predator. They were trapped in a neurological prison where the walls were made of silver vapor. Their sanity was like fine silk soaked in acid, disintegrating thread by thread until there was nothing left but the echo of the man they used to be. This was the silent, silvery slaughter of the mind, hidden behind the elegant brim of a gentleman's crown. Why was this systematic slaughter allowed to continue for nearly a century? Because the cost was hidden beneath layers of velvet and social hierarchy. The hats were breathtakingly beautiful, the profit margins were staggering, and the victims were poor, replaceable, and voiceless. In the cold, calculating logic of the Industrial Revolution, a hatter's life was considered a fair trade for a gentleman's vanity. This was an era where the weight of gold far surpassed the value of human sanity. From the foggy alleys of London to the hat city of Danbury, Connecticut, the grim narrative was identical. The air in these manufacturing hubs became so saturated with mercury that the very soil beneath the residents' feet turned toxic. Yet, the medical and political communities remained largely silent or deliberately confused. As long as the madness was confined to the lower-class artisans, society chose to look away. In the dark storybook of 19th-century industry, laws were designed to protect the gears of production, not the flesh and blood that greased them. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the silver demon was finally banished from the workshops by law. But for the thousands of men and women who died with vibrating limbs and shattered souls, the regulation arrived 100 years too late. The factory owners danced through legal loopholes, treating every top hat sold as a silver vessel containing the drained sanity of a worker. This was more than just chemical poisoning. It was a triumph of institutional indifference, a process that ground human beings into industrial waste and covered the remains with the finest silk lining money could buy. The industry was built on a foundation of silence, where the ticking of the factory clock drowned out the frantic shaking of 1,000 dying hands. Today, we look back at the Mad Hatter as a whimsical figure of fiction, a colorful, nonsensical character in a child's tale. We have sanitized the horror. We have transformed a visceral industrial tragedy into a harmless literary curiosity. We have forgotten that behind the tea parties and the eccentric riddles lies a silent graveyard of men who paid for our ancestors' vanity with their very sanity. They were the ghosts in the machine of progress, vibrating in the dark while the world celebrated their craftsmanship. The tragedy of the Hatters serves as a haunting reminder that every age has its own Mercury. Yesterday, it was the mercuric nitrate in felt hats. Today, it might be the rare earth minerals mined in the shadows to power the devices in our pockets, or the toxic dyes in our disposable fashion. We remain a civilization that is obsessed with the sheen but remains willfully blind to the carrot. We crave the polished final product while exporting the tremors and the madness to those whose names we will never know. The physical shaking may have ceased in the old workshops of London, but the invisible interest on our global progress continues to accumulate in the dark corners of the earth. As you admire the next miracle of technology or the next trend in style, ask yourself, what is the true hidden cost? And who is currently trembling so that we may stand still? We are all participants in this grand, dark storybook, and the ink is still wet on the page. This has been the hidden cost. We will see you in the next dark chapter of our history. The truth always carries a heavy price. If you find yourself captivated by these forgotten madnesses and buried histories, subscribe and join our eternal tea party. After all, in a dark storybook like this, it's far too lonely to be the only one awake.